Welcome back everybody, my name is Tucker and today is the first episode in a long time of NBA Trade Machine. If you've been around for a while on the channel, you might know that I used to do a series called Trade Machine Tuesday, in which I would use the ESPN Trade Machine to come up with some realistic deals for any number of players around the NBA. But I didn't want to limit myself to just one specific day anymore, so I changed the name and here we are. Really quickly, I just want to be clear, these are purely speculation, and although some of them might be inspired by rumors, that doesn't necessarily mean that these guys are on the trade block. They're just players whose current situation I find interesting in terms of a possible trade. Also, the best part about this series in the past has been the comment section going absolutely crazy with suggestions for players, for future episodes, and everybody's own ideas for trades, and just a ton of discussion. So feel free to do all of that and I'll be sure to join in as well. Alright, let's go ahead and get started. Player 1, Otto Porter Jr. First up is Wizards wing Otto Porter Jr., a player that I briefly mentioned in terms of trade possibilities in the Wizards video I put out recently. He's part of a Wizards team that is underperforming and has looked like a complete disaster to begin this season, which has caused many fans to wonder when he might be on his way out of Washington. It makes sense too, I mean he's the highest paid player on the team this year as a result of a max contract offer sheet he signed with the Brooklyn Nets in restricted free agency that the Wizards ultimately matched. And despite his strong shooting contributions the past few years, he certainly isn't worth $25 million a year, and definitely not to a Wizards team that's near the bottom of the NBA standings. So when I decided to start coming up with trade possibilities for him, I thought, what team has been active in the trade market recently, is in need of some help on the wings, could use some shooting, and might be desperate enough to take on Porter's big contract? What about the Houston Rockets? They threw multiple offers at the Timberwolves for Jimmy Butler, and although obviously Porter isn't close to the same caliber player as him, they have the pieces to possibly bring him in. Here's what I'm thinking. Nene, Brandon Knight, Marcus Chris, and a top 15 protected 2020 first round pick to the Wizards for Otto Porter Jr. For the Rockets, this is a very similar deal to the one that they reportedly sent over to the Wolves for Jimmy Butler that they declined, just with less first round picks obviously. They give up expiring contracts and a pick for a guy that's really a great fit in Houston. He helps fill the gap on the wing left by the departure of some guys from last year, namely Trevor Ariza, brings them some youth and defensive ability, and his shooting ability obviously fits right in as well. The big issues here are that they're giving up some depth, specifically in the front court, but Nene is seemingly always coming back from injury, and Chris isn't in the rotation at the moment, and Isaiah Hartenstein looks ready to take on the backup big man role behind Clint Capella anyway. But even beyond that, they can look to make up for some of that depth on the buyout market later in the year if they need to. While Knight is another guy that they always seem to be waiting to come back from injury, and losing that pick likely won't be that big of a deal. So as long as they maintain their course over the next 2 seasons as one of the top teams in the West, and if they can stomach the salary cap and luxury tax implications of Porter's contract, this would be a great deal for Houston. Now let's talk about this deal for the Wizards. I'll admit right away that this probably isn't enough for Porter just straight up. He's a former top 5 pick, still just 25 years old, and has the potential to be an ideal third wheel with John Wall and Bradley Beal on the wing with his ability to space the floor and guard. But realistically, this Wizards team isn't going anywhere. Even if they turn this season around and make the playoffs, it isn't going to be a very high seed, and the top 5 in the East is suddenly extremely competitive with the Raptors, Celtics, Bucks, Sixers, and Pacers. So if you're a fan of the Wizards, would you really want to keep this group around as one of the most expensive rosters in the league just to lose in the first round of the playoffs? Personally, that's an easy choice and the answer would be no. But the problem is this team can't just blow it all up in the traditional sense, so they have to get a bit creative. Wall is nearly untradeable with his Supermax deal coming up next year, Beal is a piece that they would like to keep ideally, and that just leaves Porter. But even though they don't get great value out of this trade, essentially cap relief and a late first round pick, it is more about what it sets them up to do in the future than anything else for me. If the Wizards can get rid of Porter and his awful contract, they become real players in free agency in 2020. They can dump his deal, continue to challenge for the playoffs with Wall, Beal, and Kelly Oubre sliding into the starting 3 spot, sign players to 1-year deals in the summer of 2019, and have max contract space to bring in somebody else alongside Wall and Beal in the summer of 2020 to give them a more realistic shot at competing in the East. The big master plan here would obviously be recruiting KD to come home if he decides to stay another season in Golden State and then leaves in 2020, but when you think about this trade from a long-term perspective, it begins to make a lot of sense for the Wizards. Player 2, Markelle Fultz. Next up is the former #1 overall pick for the always interesting Philadelphia 76ers. This is a really interesting situation to me because, in my opinion, and just from reading articles and listening to podcasts, Markelle Fultz has very little, if any, trade value at the moment. You would think that people would view him as still having a lot of potential, but apparently that isn't the case. But maybe the best thing for him would be a fresh start away from Philly. In that scenario, there are really two ways the Sixers could approach this. First, they could look to flip Fultz for a young wing with high upside that could help them with their depth and lack of defensive versatility with a similar contract to the one that Fultz has, like a straight-up swap for Josh Jackson to Phoenix, for example. The Suns have too many wings and one of the worst point guard groups in the league, so pairing Fultz with a great spacing backcourt partner in Devin Booker and clearing up the logjam on the wing a bit by sending the struggling Jackson to Philadelphia would make sense to me. For the Sixers, they move on from Fultz, get back a guy that, if he can find his confidence and develop as a shooter, is exactly what they need on the wing. It's a risky play and certainly a weird trade so soon after each of them were drafted, but I could see it coming out as a win-win for both sides. The other direction they could go is to get a wing that can shoot to help them with their spacing this season, but also one that has an expiring contract, essentially dumping Fultz's salary and preparing them to have near max cap space in the summer of 2019, like sending Fultz to Orlando for Terrence Ross, for example. The Magic are the other team in contention for the title of the worst point guard group in the league along with the Suns, and could really use a young player of Fultz's potential in the backcourt after years of investing in frontcourt players in the draft. Fultz gets a fresh start just as he would in any trade, while the Sixers get a wing that can shoot on an expiring deal. I completely understand that some of you are going to come at me in the comments section saying that this is way too little value for a player of Fultz's potential, but all I can say is that in everything I've read and heard, the Sixers would be lucky to get anything of real value in return for him at the moment. Personally, I have no idea what his value is. I mean, you would think that a guy that was the #1 overall pick just last year would hold a significant amount of value to other teams, but on the court when you watch him, he just doesn't seem right, whether it's in his head, whether his shoulder is still hurting, he's got this weird relationship with his former trainer Drew Hanlon, and I don't know, maybe the best thing for him is to go somewhere else and he has more value somewhere outside of Philly, outside of the process, outside of these new high expectations that the team has now with Jimmy. But even as fun as it is to speculate on where he could potentially go and blossom, I think it's going to be difficult to find a real trade. Even though I'm attempting to outline some in this video, it's one of the weirder trade situations not only in the league right now, but that I can remember. Player 3, Kyle Korver. Last up is one of the more common names in NBA trade rumors at the moment, and the deal I've laid out for him brings back all kinds of reunions. The deal is Kyle Korver to the Bucks for Matthew Dellavedova and a top 15 protected 2019 first-round pick to the Cavs. For Korver, he would be reunited with Coach Bud from their Hawks days, including that weird year where they won 60 games together, while Delly goes back to his Cleveland roots where his NBA career first started. For the Bucks, they get one of the best shooters in the league to add to their high-volume three-point attack and provide even more spacing for Giannis, Eric Bledsoe, and Chris Middleton, without giving up basically anything in terms of on-court value for this season, as Delly isn't all that important to them at the moment. Korver isn't going to provide them much on the defensive end and might not even be able to stay on the floor in a playoff series, a common trait among a few of their role players that's certainly concerning. But if they're looking for a short-term gain kind of piece to help them get as high of a seed in the regular season standings as possible and give them another option to go to in the postseason, then Korver is a good option. For the Cavs, they should be in full tank mode, and getting as many assets and draft picks as possible is part of that. Korver doesn't help them much at the moment, and they should be prioritizing the development of their few precious young players rather than wins right now anyway. The pick they receive would likely be late in the first round, but any kind of draft capital is a positive for them at the moment, and although swapping the contracts of Korver and Delly doesn't really help them in terms of the salary cap, it does turn into an expiring deal next season, which could bring some value to an otherwise pretty valueless player at the moment. One thing I will say here is it is possible that Korver gets bought out fairly soon, and the Bucks could have a chance to sign him without giving up any assets. But even with his connection to Coach Bud, there's no guarantee that they would be able to sign him over the handful of other teams that would be chasing after his services. At least this way they guarantee his presence and add even more shooting to their offense, something that they do still need and that you can never really have enough of in the modern NBA. And that is going to be the end of the first NBA Trade Machine episode of the season, and I thank you all very much for watching. Just like I said in the beginning, I'm expecting these videos to create a lot of discussion in the comment section below, so if you have any thoughts on these trades or trades of your own or other players you'd like for me to cover in the future, I'd love to discuss that with you. With all that said, once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.